4 Apache brides were condemned for being barren, until a cowboy offered them his name. The first one came out of the canyon at dawn, and I almost shot her. I had my rifle up before I even got the sleep out of my eyes, the stock cold against my cheek and the bead sitting right on her chest. She didn't stop walking, didn't raise her hands, didn't make any sound that I could hear over the wind coming down off the mesa. She just kept coming, small, wrapped in a blanket the color of dried blood, her feet moving through the caliche like she'd already accepted whatever was going to happen next and wasn't going to waste any more of herself fighting it. I lowered the barrel. I don't know why. I could tell you it was because she was a woman, but that's not the whole truth. I'd been in enough country to know women can put an arrow through you same as any man. I could tell you I recognized the look on her face from 40 yards, but that sounds like the kind of thing a man says in a story, not something real. The truth is I put the rifle down because something about the way she walked told me she wasn't a danger to me. She was past danger. She was past most things. She stopped about 10 feet from where I was crouched beside the fire ring. The coals were still orange underneath, giving off just enough warmth to see by. She looked at me for a long time without speaking. Apache, I could see that clearly, the way her hair was dressed, the cut of the wrap, the beadwork on the pouch she carried at her hip. Her face was older than her body. That's the only way I know to put it. Her eyes had a quality to them that comes from a specific kind of experience. Not age, not hardship exactly, but the particular looking out that a person does when they have been required to see clearly in situations where they would have preferred to look away. I said in the little Apache I had, "You're alone." She said in better English than I expected, "There are 4 of us." Then she sat down on the ground, right where she was standing, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and just set it down. The blanket pooled around her. She didn't look at me while she did it. She looked at the fire ring. Her name was Custid, but she told me later that it meant something like she who was sent away. And that wasn't her birth name. Her birth name was the kind of thing the band took back when they decided you weren't worth keeping anymore. I never asked what it was. Didn't seem like it was mine to ask. The other 3 came in out of the canyon before full light. They came in a line, each of them wrapped, each of them moving the way the first one had, not hurrying, not hiding. Like women who have used up their fear and are running on something quieter and harder underneath. They came and stopped and stood and looked at me, and I looked back, and we all stayed that way for what felt like a long time but was probably only 30 seconds. I won't pretend I knew what to do. I had a homestead claim on 160 acres of the worst land in the territory, red dirt, 1 reliable spring, a second one that sometimes ran and sometimes didn't, good grass in the low draw but nothing that would make a cattleman look twice. I had a house that was barely a house, 3 rooms, 2 of them without proper floors, a stovepipe that drew wrong and filled the kitchen with smoke every time the wind turned north. I had a mule named Garrison who was old and had opinions, and 6 head of cattle, and a credit account at the Harrington Supply post in Sacaton that I was already running too close to the edge of. I did not have anything extra. I did not have a plan for this situation. I stood there in the early dark with 4 women looking at me, and the fire burning low and Garrison making some sort of comment from the corral, and I thought, well, here we are. I made them coffee. That was the first thing. I had a pot that was big enough if I kept it weak, and I made it and poured it into my 1 decent cup and the 2 tin ones and a jar I'd been using to store nails, and I handed them out in order of who was sitting closest, and for a while none of us said anything. The first one, I'd started thinking of her in my head as the first one because I didn't have anything else to call her yet. She watched me pour and hand out the cups, and she watched me go back for the jar last and drink from that myself, and something shifted in her face. Not a smile. Something quieter than that. An acknowledgement maybe, like she'd been measuring something and the measurement had come back all right. I got some cornbread out of the box on the shelf. I'd made it 2 days before and it was dry, but it was there, and I set it on the table and they ate it. Nobody said anything for a while. The light came up outside the window, slow and gray, and a crow started somewhere off to the east, and Garrison made another comment from the corral, and we sat and drank coffee and ate cornbread and didn't say anything. Then the first one put her cup down and said, "Why?" I said, "Why what?" She said, "Why do you not send us away?" I said, "I haven't got a good reason to." She looked at me steadily, waiting for something more than that. I said, "I've been run off enough places in my life. Doesn't sit right with me to do it to someone else." That was true. It wasn't a practiced line. It was just the truth that came up when I looked for an answer. I found out the rest that morning, piece by piece, with the first one doing most of the translating. The Apache word she used for what had happened to them, I don't remember exactly. The concept I understood. A woman in the band who does not bear children is a problem, not a sin, not in the way a white preacher would call it a sin, but a practical fact that the band eventually has to deal with. Mouths that eat and hands that work, but no children coming, no new band members, no future built. The men who had taken these four as wives had waited, some of them years, and eventually the elders had looked at the situation and made a decision. The women were put out. The marriages dissolved. The names given back. The band moved on without them, headed somewhere I never found out, and left these four women standing in the canyon with what they could carry. None of them were sick. None of them were old. The youngest looked to be about 22 or 23, the oldest maybe 40. They were all healthy, all strong, all clearly capable of work. They just had not given anyone a child. I sat with that for a while. Outside, the morning was fully up now, and I could hear a red-tailed hawk going back and forth somewhere over the east pasture, and the cattle moved once in the draw, a slow sound, unhurried. I looked at the table. I looked at the four women at my table. I said finally, "Where were you going?" The first one said, "Wherever the land allowed." That's a way of saying nowhere in particular. A way of saying we didn't have a plan because there was no plan available. I'd heard that kind of answer before, from drifters, from men who'd lost their stakes, from people who were still moving because stopping was worse. It's the answer of someone who's run out of better options and is just putting one foot in front of the other until something changes. I looked at my place. Looked at the 3 rooms and the bad stovepipe, and the 2/3 empty woodpile, and the 6 cattle and the mule. I said, "I have work." She looked at me for a long time, then she said, "What kind of work?" I said, "The kind that needs more than one pair of hands. I'm a month behind on everything. Fencing, cattle condition, wood, the 2nd room that I framed in June and haven't touched since. I've been trying to do this place alone for 2 years and it's beating me, and I know it's beating me." She translated for the others. There was a conversation I couldn't follow, quick, low, the rhythm of it serious. Not arguing exactly, but people weighing something. The third one quick-eyed, a scar along her left jaw that was old and healed clean. She said something that went on for a while. The first one answered it. The third one said something else. The first one looked at me, then back at the third one and said something that seemed to settle it, and the conversation stopped. Then she looked at me and said, "What do you want from us?" I said, "I want help, work. I'll feed everyone, shelter everyone, treat everyone fair. Nobody's property here. Nobody gets to hurt anyone, that's the deal." Another conversation I couldn't follow, shorter this time. Then she said, "What name do you offer?" I didn't understand the question at first. She had to explain it to me, through what felt like careful words, like she was watching to see if I understood what I was agreeing to. In the situation they were in, 4 Apache women without a band, without family, without any standing in any community, white or Apache. The only protection they had in this territory was if someone could point to them and say, "Those women belong somewhere, they have someone, they are not strays." Without that, every man on a horse was a potential problem. Every encounter on the road was a risk. Every lawman or Indian agent or rancher with opinions was something they had to survive rather than simply navigate. The name wasn't marriage, she explained, or not necessarily. It was something older than that and more practical. It was the name on the claim, the name in the county record, the name that could be said if a man rode up and asked who these women were and what business they had being here. The name on the land was the name that could cover them, same as a roof covers a house. I said my name, Callum Rye, and I said, if you want to use it, use it. I'll file it in Sakatan, that's up to you. That conversation between the four of them went on longer. The youngest one, she'd barely said anything, just watched everything with dark, serious eyes. She looked at me once during it with an expression I couldn't read. The third one, the one with the scar, she said something sharp, and the first one said something back, and they went back and forth twice more, and then the oldest one, who had been quiet all morning, said something short and low, and after that it stopped. The first one looked at me. She said, "We will stay, for now." For now, I appreciated that. It was honest. It wasn't gratitude performed, wasn't obligation accepted. It was a statement of fact about where things stood right now, with room built into it for where things might go later. I'd rather have that than a promise that was really just the absence of alternatives. I said, "For now is fine." What happened over the next 8 months is hard to compress into something short. It was work mostly. That's what it was. Hard, grinding, daily work that started before the sun and ended after it, and didn't stop for weather or mood or any of the 100 things that can make a man feel sorry for himself. Cussid, the first one, she gave herself a new name, eventually. She said the name the band had given her was not a name she wanted to carry anymore. The new one was Hoocha. It meant something I never fully got a translation on, something between one who remains and one who endures. I called her that and she didn't correct me, so I figured I was close enough. The other 3 were Naku, Chashka, and Yiskai. Naku was the oldest, the one who'd spoken during the conversation that morning and ended it. She was quiet and deliberate and moved like someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. She watched things carefully before she said anything about them, and when she did say something, it was usually right. Chashka was the third one, the one with the scar along her jaw, and she was quick and wiry and had opinions about everything, and expressed them freely whether you wanted them or not. I found her aggravating for the first 2 weeks, and then I understood her and stopped finding her aggravating. Yiskai was the youngest. She said almost nothing for the first 6 weeks. They knew things I didn't know. That sounds simple, but it wasn't. I'd been out here 2 years and I thought I knew this land. I didn't know it the way they knew it. Hoocha walked the upper draw with me in the first week and showed me where a third spring was running underground, not much, but consistent, clean, never going to fail even in the worst of August. I'd walked that ground a dozen times and not seen it. She showed me where it came up damp in a low place between 2 rock formations, and she said, "Here, dig here." We dug 3 feet and hit clean water. I don't know how she knew. When I asked, she said she'd been reading the plants, a specific grass that grew thicker in 2 spots along the upper draw, a kind that needs water below it to grow the way it was growing. I wouldn't have looked at that grass and seen anything except grass. She looked at it and saw water. Naku knew medicinal plants, knew which ones and where they grew and what they did. I'm not a man given to that kind of thing. I'd always just relied on what I could get at the supply post in Sakatan. But twice that winter my chest went bad with the cold getting into it. The kind of bad where you wake up before dawn with your lungs feeling full of wet wool and your whole body aching. And Naku made something she boiled in a small pot she kept for herself and made me drink it twice a day. Both times I was better in 2 days. Whether that was the medicine or it would have passed anyway, I can't say for certain. But I didn't argue with the results. Chashka could work cattle like no one I'd ever seen. She wasn't big, none of them were, but she was fast and fearless, and she read what an animal was going to do about 2 seconds before it did it. It was uncanny to watch. She'd move and the cattle would move, not in the chasing way that burns them out and raises their blood, but in a way that seemed almost like conversation, like she was just suggesting direction and they were agreeing. One morning in October, I was trying to push 3 strays back through a break in the west fence, and I was losing the argument badly, getting outrun and turned. And she came up on foot from the left side where I hadn't even known she was watching, and had all 3 of them back through the fence inside of 10 minutes while I was still catching my breath. She looked at me after, dust on her face, not even winded, and said something in Apache. I said, "What?" She said, "You are too loud." That was the most she'd said to me in 3 weeks. I took it the way it was meant, as instruction, not insult. She was right. I'd been working cattle the way I'd been taught, which was with noise and pressure, and she worked them entirely differently. I watched her after that and tried to learn what I could. I worked at being quieter around them. It helped. Yiskai, the youngest, the quiet one, she started talking in her own time, as things do. She'd been the most recently put out of the band, I figured. Her wound was the freshest. She took longer to get her balance. But when she did come around, she came around all the way, and she was the one who figured out the stovepipe. She spent 2 days studying it, not working on it, just looking. She'd stand in the kitchen while I cooked something and watch where the smoke went, watch the draft, poke at the joints with one finger. She asked through Hoocha what it had done since I built it. When did it draw well, when did it not? What direction was the wind on the bad days? Had I changed anything since I put it in? I answered as best I could. She'd nod and go back to looking. Then she told Hoocha what she needed. A specific length of tin and a certain size of elbow joint. And she described the elbow in enough detail that Hoocha could translate it into something I could actually find. I rode to Sakatan and got as close as I could to what she'd described. She spent one morning making changes that I watched but only partly followed. Something about the angle of the exit. Something about a gap in one joint that she filled with wet clay and let dry before she'd touch anything else. At the end of that morning, we lit the stove and the smoke went up and out and stayed there. The kitchen was clear for the first time in 2 years. Chashka said something that made Naku and Yiskai both laugh, an actual laugh. Yiskai's first one that I'd heard. Even Hoocha smiled, which wasn't something she did carelessly. I sat there in a kitchen that wasn't full of smoke and felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Like this place might actually work. I need to be honest about something here. Because I'm telling this the way it happened, not the way it would look better if I rearranged it. I'd been alone for a long time before those 4 women walked in out of the canyon. Not just the 2 years on the claim. Longer than that. I'd been alone in the way a man gets alone when he's worked too many places and stayed too long in none of them and made the mistake of believing, somewhere in his 40s, that this was just how it was going to be for him. You stop expecting company. You stop expecting anyone to see you particularly. You do your work and you sleep, and you do your work again, and the years move and you tell yourself it's enough because it's what you have. It wasn't enough. I knew that somewhere underneath, the way you know a thing you've decided not to look at directly. But I didn't know what to do about it, so I didn't do anything. Having 4 people in the house changed things I hadn't known were wrong. The noise first, people moving, talking, working, existing. Sounds at night that weren't wind or animals. Mornings that weren't just me and silence and the specific loneliness of making 1 pot of coffee and drinking all of it yourself. Evenings around the stove where sometimes nobody said anything but the not saying anything was different, was shared, was the kind of quiet that comes from people being comfortable together rather than the kind that comes from being the only one there. I hadn't known the difference until I had the comparison. And the work changed. Not just that there was more of it getting done, which was true, we were ahead for the first time since I'd filed the claim, but the meaning of it changed in some way that I'm having trouble putting into plain words. When I fixed the fence on the north pasture in October, when I got the cattle into good condition for the coming cold, when I worked out the rotation on the grass that kept them fed through January, I was doing it for something. Not for an abstract idea of my own future. For actual people who were actually there, and would actually eat and be warm or not eat, and be cold depending on how well I did my job. I hadn't had that in a long time. There's something in a man that requires it. I don't know how to say that without sounding like I'm asking for something I shouldn't ask for, but it's true. The work means something different when it lands somewhere. When it's not just you maintaining yourself in the middle of nowhere so you can maintain yourself some more. I was needed. Not as a charity case, not as someone being tolerated. As the man who could do the things that needed doing, who could provide what needed providing, who could stand between these women and the territory's particular variety of hazards, and be enough to handle what came. That mattered to me. It mattered more than I'd expected, and I paid attention to that. There were hazards. I should talk about those. In February, 3 riders came onto the property. They didn't announce themselves the way a man with good intentions announces himself. They rode the east fence line slowly, like they were taking inventory, and I watched them from the house roof with my rifle across my knees, and I watched them watch the place. I knew 2 of them by sight, Dortmund brothers, ran a spread over toward the Sakaten Road that they'd expanded twice in the past year by pushing out small claim holders on manufactured back payment debts, with the help of a county assessor whose opinion seemed to be available for purchase. I'd been waiting for something like this, not from them specifically, but from that type. 4 Apache women living on a white man's claim in the territory. I was not naive enough to think that would pass without notice or without someone deciding it represented an opportunity. I put the rifle in the scabbard and rode out to meet them before they got any closer to the house. The older Dortmund, thick through the chest, a beard like something dead and brown attached to his face, he said, with the pleasantness of a man who's decided he's already won something. Heard you've got Apache women living here. I said, I've got people working my claim, yes. He said, territory being what it is. He left it at that, which was how men like him operated. They said half a thing and let you supply the other half, so that when it came to trouble later they could say they'd never threatened anyone, they'd just been making conversation. I said, territory's fine. He said, some men might be concerned about the nature of the arrangement. I said, my name's on the claim. Their names go on a record in Sakaten that I'm filing this week. What's the concern exactly? He didn't have an answer for that, or not one he was ready to say out loud. He looked at the place, at the cattle, at the east fence which was in better shape than it had been in when he'd ridden this road 3 months ago, at the roof which we'd patched in November, and something moved across his face that I recognized. A recalculation. He'd come expecting to find a mess, or something that could be made into one. He found the opposite. I said, I'll tell you flat. These women are under my name, they're on my claim, they're working my land, and I'll defend all 3 of those facts as far as I need to. That's not a threat, it's information. He looked at me for a longer moment this time. Men like him are always calculating something, always measuring whether what they're looking at is worth the cost. He measured me, and whatever he saw told him the cost was higher than he wanted to pay. He said, just being neighborly. I said, appreciated. He turned and rode out, and the other 2 went with him, and I watched them all the way to the road. When I turned back to the house, Chashka was in the doorway. She'd been watching the whole thing from there, arms crossed, not hiding. She said something in Apache. I looked at Hucha, who was a few feet behind her. Hucha said, she says you didn't raise your voice. I said, didn't need to. Hucha translated. Chashka made a sound that I was starting to recognize as her version of approval, which sounded to everyone else like mild contempt, but wasn't, once you understood her. The Dortmunds didn't come back. In March, 2 men from the county assessor's office came to inspect the claim. They said it was routine, going around to all the small claims in the lower territory that hadn't been assessed since filing. I walked them around myself. I showed them the springs, all 3 of them now, the new one in the upper draw shored up properly with cut stone. I showed them the cattle, which were in good shape for March, better than most operations of that size would be. I showed them the house, the addition we'd framed and were working on, the fence line. One of the assessors, young, wore his hat like a man who was new to hat wearing and wasn't sure yet where exactly it belonged. He wrote things in a small book, and then he looked up and said, "You've done good work here." I said, "We've done good work here." He wrote something else in his book. "I want to tell you about a night in April. It was the night I understood what was actually happening, though I didn't name it to myself right away. Naku had been sick for about a week, not seriously, but enough to be off her feet, which for Naku was unusual enough that it worried everyone. She was the one who didn't stop. She was moving before me most mornings, and she was the last one to sit down in the evenings, and she'd been doing that since October without complaint. When she finally stopped, you noticed it. The house had a different weight to it, a missing sound. Hucha and Yiskai took turns sitting with her, keeping the back room warm, keeping water and the medicine Naku had made for herself available when she wanted it. I made broth from a beef neck bone I'd been saving and brought it in to her twice a day, because broth was the only thing I knew how to do for sick people that didn't require medicine I didn't have. She took it without complaint. She didn't complain about anything, which was partly just her character and partly, I thought, a kind of dignity she kept for herself. By Thursday she was sitting up. By Saturday she was arguing with Chashka about the cattle rotation, which meant she was fully recovered. That Saturday evening I was at the table after supper, working on the record book accounts, cattle count, supply list for the Sakatan run, the things a man with a claim has to keep current or they get away from him. Hucha was at the other end of the table with a piece of sewing she'd been working on in the evenings, the lamp between us burning steady in the still air, and the other three had gone to bed. It was quiet, the good kind of quiet. She said, without looking up from the sewing, "Naku says you watched her door at night." I said, "I was up late those nights anyway." She says you checked her fire. I said, "The stove runs cold in the back room if you don't watch the damper." Hucha put the sewing down and looked at me. She had a direct way of looking at a person that I'd gotten used to over the months, but that still carried some weight to it. Not accusatory, not warm exactly either. Just honest. Like she was seeing what was actually there and neither adding to it nor taking away. She said, "You did not have to take us in." I said, "I needed the help." She said, "You did not have to offer your name." I said, "Seemed like the right thing." She said, "Many men in this territory would not think so." I didn't have an answer for that didn't sound like I was building towards something, so I didn't give one. She picked the sewing up again. A minute passed. The lamp didn't flicker. Outside it was still and cold, the way April nights get out here when the days have been warm and the temperature drops fast at dark. She said, "The other three have talked about what they will do when the land is settled and things are easier." I said, "Oh." She said, "They talk about different things. Naku speaks of going south, toward the border country, where there are still some of the old places she knows. Yiskai does not know yet. Chashka says she will go wherever the cattle work is best." I looked at the record book without reading it. She said, "I have not decided what I will do." I said, "There's no hurry." She said, "No." Another minute passed between us. She said, "I want to tell you something. You can do with it what you want." I said, "All right." She said, "In the band, when a woman is put out, and I have known four before us who were, the women do not think first about where they will go. They think first about whether they were wrong to be who they were. Whether the life they lived was a wrong life, because it did not produce what the band required." She paused. The lamp was steady in the still air. She said, "I spent a long time thinking I was wrong to be who I was." She said, "This winter I stopped thinking that." I said, "What changed?" She said, "Someone saw us as worth the trouble." She went back to her sewing. I went back to the record book. The stove ticked in the silence. Outside, very far off, a coyote said something to the dark and got no answer back. I didn't sleep well that night, but it wasn't an unhappy kind of not sleeping. Summer came on hard and fast, the way it does in that country, not a gradual warming but a sudden turn, temperature going from cold nights to furnace days inside of 2 weeks in May, the air drying out like paper left too long near a fire. We moved the cattle to the upper pasture where the shade was better, and the spring grass was still green from the winter runoff, and we started on the addition in earnest, which we'd been planning since February when it became obvious that 4 people in 2 back rooms was workable, but only barely. I was never handy with a hammer. I knew enough to build a thing that stood up and didn't fall down, but not much more than that. Yiskai, who had figured out the stovepipe, had the kind of mind that sees structure clearly. She could look at a framing problem and see the answer where I saw only a question. She and I worked on the addition together most days through May and June, and it was good work, the kind where you don't talk much because the task takes what talking would use, and at the end of each day you can see what you've done, which is its own kind of satisfaction that nothing else quite gives you. She was patient with my hammer work. When I did something wrong, she'd come and look at it without expression and then show me what was right, not by telling me but by demonstrating hands on the material, showing the angle or the sequence, then stepping back and letting me try again. She was a good teacher that way, the teaching that goes through the hands rather than the mouth. Chashka moved the cattle herself most days that summer. I wasn't needed for that. She'd made it clear with characteristic bluntness that I slowed things down, and what I was needed for was the fence, which was endless in the way fence always is, and the supply runs to Sakatan every 3 weeks, and the water management through the dry weeks in July and August, which required careful rotation to keep everything and everyone watered without running the springs down. Those July weeks were the hardest. The temperature in the afternoons was what it always is out here in summer, the kind of heat that sits on your chest when you're working and makes every task take twice the effort. I was out at the springs every morning checking levels, moving cattle every 2 or 3 days to spread the load, rationing from the rainwater barrels I'd set up in March on Hooch's suggestion. It was close management. I won't pretend it wasn't close. There was one afternoon in the second week of July when I thought we were going to lose one of the younger steers. He'd gotten into something, a plant, or bad water from a low pool near the east fence that I'd missed on my rounds, and by midday he was down, sides heaving, not responding to anything I tried. I knew what that looked like. I'd lost cattle to the same signs before, and I knew what was usually at the end of it. Naku came out to where I was crouched beside him, looked at the animal for a moment, went back to the house. She came back with a bundle of things from her medicine stores and spent the next 2 hours doing something I couldn't follow with plants and water, and a preparation she made on a small fire she built away from the steer. I kept him still, that was my contribution, just keeping him calm and on his side so he didn't thrash and make it worse. At some point late in the afternoon something in him shifted. He wasn't dying anymore. By evening he was standing. By morning he was eating. I said to Naku, "What was it?" She named a plant in Apache. I didn't recognize the name. I said, "Where does it grow?" She pointed toward the lower draw, the shaded side. I'd walked that ground 100 times. I'd never noticed what she was pointing at. She looked at me with her characteristic patience and said, "Through Hoocha, you are looking for the obvious. The useful things are usually quiet." I thought about that for a long time after. She meant the plant, but she might have meant other things too. But we got through the summer, all of us and all the cattle, everyone. The Dortmunds made one more appearance that summer in late July. They didn't come to the property this time. I saw them in Sakatan when I was at the supply post on the same street, and the older one looked across at me and held the look for a moment and then turned and walked the other way. That was all, but it was enough. It was a man revising his calculation and deciding the revised version wasn't worth acting on. I took it for what it was and loaded my supplies and rode home. The county assessor sent a letter in August. I'm still not entirely sure what prompted it. It might have been the young one with the hat, the one who'd seemed to look at the place honestly and see what it actually was. The letter confirmed the claim in good standing, noted improvements to the assessed value, and made formal record of the names I'd added in February. Whatever legal uncertainty had existed before was settled now. The claim was clean, the names were on record, and that was that. I read the letter sitting on the porch in the evening with the sun going down behind the mesa and the cattle sounds coming up from the draw, and Hoocha came out after a while and asked what it said. I told her. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land, and then she said, "Good." Just that word, but there was a weight in it, a relieved weight that told me she'd been carrying something she'd been careful not to show me. In September, Naku left. She'd been talking about it since spring, the South, the border country, a cousin who'd gone that direction years ago and hadn't been heard from but might still be findable. She was methodical about it. She spent 2 weeks getting herself ready, mending what needed mending, gathering what she'd need, asking me careful questions about the road south and what water there was and what towns. I answered everything I could and drew her a rough map of the route I'd have taken, with the reliable water marked. We made her a pack with what she needed. I gave her what I could spare from the supply account in coin and some dried beef and biscuit. She and Hoocha talked for a long time the evening before she left in Apache, and I stayed out of it. In the morning she embraced each of the others in turn, and then she looked at me and said something short in Apache and turned and walked. I watched her out of sight. I asked Hoocha what she'd said. Hoocha said, "She said you are a man worth the following." I stood with that for a while. Chashka left in October for the cattle work, as she'd said she would all along. She'd heard from a man in Sakatan about an operation 40 miles east that was taking on hands for the fall roundup, and she went. She shook my hand when she left, which was more formality than I'd expected from her, and she said in English, "The cattle are in good shape." Which I understood was high praise from Chashka. It wasn't nothing. From her it was exactly what she meant, no more and no less. Yiskai stayed through October and into November. She finished the addition. She'd been working on the roof since Chashka left, and she wouldn't go until the roof was on and solid, which I found touching in a way I didn't say out loud. On the day she finished, she stood outside and looked at it for a long moment, and I stood beside her looking at it too, and it was a good roof. It would hold what needed holding. When she finally left, she gave me a small carved piece of bone, a horse that she'd made sometime in the winter and been carrying with her. I didn't know what to say. She said something to Hoocha. Hoocha said, "She says you gave her somewhere to stand while she found out who she was." I looked at the little carved horse in my hand. It was small enough to fit in my palm, and the work was careful. You could see the legs, the head, the shape of a mane. I said, "She can have the north pasture room any time she wants it." Hoocha translated. Yiskai made a sound that was a laugh, the first real laugh I'd heard from her, clear and quick, and then she was walking, and then she was gone. And then it was just Hoocha and me. That wasn't a surprise, exactly. I'd known for a while that it was probably how it would go, not because the others didn't value what we'd built here, but because Hoocha was the one who had the most of herself anchored in this place. She'd found the spring. She'd been the one to negotiate that first morning, to take the measure of me, to decide it was worth trusting. She'd said from the first, for now, and now had kept extending itself month by month in the way of things that are actually working. We didn't talk about what it meant right away. There was too much November to do for talking. The cattle needed to be pulled off the upper pasture and down into the draw before the cold came in hard. The wood needed to be stacked the full north wall of the house, floor to eave, which is what I'd learned it took to get through January and February out here. The addition Yiskai had finished needed its floor. Hoocha wanted clay tile, not plank, and we spent 2 weeks on that, which was longer than I'd expected, but the result was solid and even and would hold heat better than wood. The provisions from Sakatan, the roof check, the spring check, the fence check. We worked from light to dark, and by the time we ate dinner and sat at the table, we were tired in the good way. The way you're tired when you've done what needed doing and it's done. And often we just sat and didn't say much, and that was fine. That kind of quiet between two people doing the same work for the same reasons is one of the better things a life can contain, though I wouldn't have known how to say that a year before. One evening in late November, she made something at the stove that I didn't recognize. She'd been cooking in the Apache way more and more as the weather turned cold, using things from the stores she kept in the small room off the kitchen, dried and bundled, the smells of them unfamiliar and not unpleasant. We sat at the table and ate it, and outside it was coming dark early, the way November dark comes early in this country, pressing against the window glass like something waiting, and the lamp was lit, and the stove was going, and the house was warm. She said, "I want to tell you what I've decided." I put down my fork. She said, "I have decided to stay." I said, "All right." She said, "Not for now, for as long as this place stands." She wasn't looking for something in my face, the way some people look for confirmation when they say something they're uncertain about. She was just telling me a fact she'd worked out, from the inside and had finished working out. That was Hoocha. She did the thinking before the speaking, and by the time she spoke she was certain. I said, that suits me. She said, I want to be clear about what I mean. I said, I think I understand. She said, I am not staying because there is nowhere else to go. I have places I could go. I am staying because this is where I choose to be. She looked at me then, with those direct eyes that never wavered. She said, I am staying because of you, the kind of man you are, the things you did and the way you did them, not because you had to, because you chose to. A minute went by, the fire ticked. Garrison moved once in the corral. I said, I'm not an easy man. She said, I know. I said, this place is not a comfortable life. She said, I know that too. I said, you know what you're choosing. She said, better than you know what I'm choosing. I didn't argue with that. It was true and we both knew it. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, calloused, small, strong, the knuckles a little rough from the work of the fall, warm under my palm. She didn't pull back. She turned her hand over and held mine, her fingers closing over my fingers, and we stayed that way for a while without moving. The lamp burned steady. The stove ticked in the silence. Outside the window, the first real winter came down off the mesa, soft, cold, just the leading edge of it, and touched the glass. I said, Callum Rye's an ugly name. She said, I have heard uglier. I said, in the spring if you still want. She said, in the spring. The winter was long and still and cold. We worked it together, the two of us, and it didn't break us. The cattle came through healthy, better than I'd had any right to expect, given how the first 2 winters had gone when I was doing it alone. The springs ran clean. The addition held solid through the worst of February, which is when this country tests what you've built. The clay tile floor in the addition turned out to be the right call. It kept the heat in the way Hoocha had said it would, and that room was the warmest in the house through January. There was an evening in December, a week before Christmas, when a man came to the door. He was on foot, which was unusual enough to be worth noting. Men out here don't generally end up on foot by choice. He was white, maybe 50, wore a coat that had been good once and wasn't anymore, and he had the look of someone who'd made a series of decisions that hadn't worked out. He said he needed a meal and a place to sleep one night. Said his horse had gone lame 6 miles back and he'd left it at a farm. He named a name I didn't know and was trying to make Sacaton. I looked at him in the doorway for a moment. Hoocha was behind me, not visible from where he stood. I said, come in. I fed him. We all sat at the table, him, me, Hoocha, Chashka, Yiskai. Naku was already in bed with a head cold. The man ate without saying anything for a while, and then he started looking at the women. Not a single look, which you can excuse in a man who's not used to a particular situation. A series of looks. The kind that keep coming back to something, that carry a specific quality of assessment that I didn't like. He said, pleasant enough, you run a particular kind of operation here. I said, I run a ranch. He said, right. He finished eating. He helped himself to another serving without asking, which I noted. He kept looking at the women, or at Chashka specifically, who met his eyes each time without blinking. There was a quality in his looking that I'd seen before, in certain places, and it meant a specific thing that I wasn't going to allow to develop. I said, I'll put a blanket in the barn for you. It's warm enough in there with the animals. He looked at me. He'd expected the house. I said, it's comfortable. I've slept there myself in bad weather. Something in my face or my voice, or the way I was sitting settled the question for him. He said, that's fine, and he ate the rest of what was on his plate, and I took him out to the barn, and I showed him where the blankets were and where he could put down, and I came back to the house. I sat at the table. Chashka was still at the table. She looked at me. She said in English, which she'd been using more, good. I said, is that what you thought? She said, I thought you would put him in the house. I said, why would I do that? She looked at me steadily for a moment. Then she said, some men are afraid to say no to another man. I said, I'm not. She said, I know that now. She got up and went to bed. I sat at the table for a while in the quiet. In the morning, the man was gone before I was up, left at first light, which suited everyone, and I checked the barn for anything missing and nothing was. He'd folded the blanket and left it where I'd shown him, which was more than I'd expected. I didn't mention it to Hoocha, and she didn't mention it to me. But there was something in the way she looked at me that morning, just once, across the table over the coffee, that told me she'd been awake and listening and had heard the barn door go. There are long weeks in January and February where you don't go to Sacaton, don't see another person, don't have any reason to look past the fence line. Some men go strange in those weeks. I'd gone strange in them before in the first 2 winters, when the silence had a quality that got into you and made everything feel smaller and grayer than it actually was. That winter it was different. The silence was occupied by 2 people, and occupied silence is a different animal entirely. It has warmth in it. We talked more in those weeks than I'd expected, maybe more than I'd talked to any single person in 10 years. Not about large things necessarily. The cattle, the weather, the fence condition, the provisions, the spring levels, but also other things. She told me about the places she'd been with the band, the country they'd moved through, a quality of those places that she described in terms I sometimes didn't fully follow, but that I listened to, because I wanted to understand what it was she was carrying. I told her about where I'd come from, Indiana, then Missouri, then a string of places westward that blurs in my memory now into a general progression toward here. I told her about the places I'd worked, and why I'd left them, and about filing the claim in Sacaton, and what I'd expected from it, and what I'd found instead. She listened the way she did everything, completely, without interruption, with whatever she needed to understand the thing before she responded to it. One night in February, somewhere in the middle of the worst cold week, she said, "Were you afraid when we came in that morning?" I thought about that. I said, "Not afraid exactly, uncertain." She said, "Of us." I said, "Of getting it wrong, whatever it was going to turn out to be, getting it wrong." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You didn't." I said, "I know that now." She said, "You knew it then. You made coffee first. A man who is afraid of a thing does not make it coffee." I thought about that for a while after she'd gone to bed. She was right. Whatever I'd felt that morning, the uncertainty, the strangeness of it, the not knowing, I hadn't been afraid of them. I'd been afraid of the responsibility, maybe, of being adequate to whatever was about to be asked of me. I'd been adequate, more than some days, and the knowing of that sat in me in a way that was different from how I'd felt before all this, when the work had been just maintenance, just keeping myself going through the years. Now when I thought about what I'd done, what I'd managed to provide and protect and hold together, it had a weight to it, a good weight, the kind that tells you something you've done has mattered. In the spring we rode to Sacaton and made it formal, at the courthouse, with a clerk who didn't look particularly surprised and a justice of the peace who was businesslike and brief. We were businesslike and brief in return. Riding home, the country was green the way it only gets in the weeks right after the last cold breaks, that particular green that doesn't last, that you have to see while it's there. We came up the last rise and the place was in front of us in the late afternoon light, low and stone and settled looking, the way a place looks when it's been cared for. The cattle were in the draw, smoke from the stovepipe going straight up in the still air. The addition solid on the south end, Yiskai's roof holding. Hoocha looked at it without speaking for a moment. She said, "It's a good place." I said, "It's going to be better." She looked at me then, one look, plain and direct, no performance in it, just the look of a woman who has made a clear-eyed decision and is at peace with it. And I looked back at her, at this woman who had walked out of a canyon with nothing and seen something in me worth choosing, who had measured me carefully and honestly and found me worth the staying. Whatever I'd been before, the man who worked alone, who'd stopped expecting to be valued, who told himself that the absence of anyone seeing him was just the condition of his life, that was over. I knew it looking at her on that rise in the spring light. I said, "Let's go in." We rode down to the house. We went in. The day's work was waiting for us and we did it.